You're listening to Tune Dig, a conversation between two lifelong friends about the power of music, one album at a time. I'm Cliff Seal.
And I'm Kyle Stapleton. Each episode, we talk about a single album in depth, unpacking it through conversation to understand what makes it worth appreciating and learning a little bit about life along the way.
If you're listening for the first time because we're covering an artist or a record you love, we promise you'll learn something new or gain a new perspective by the end of the episode.
And if you've stuck with us for multiple episodes, you know by now that you're bound to expand your horizons as we share clear entry points for artists you may never have tried to get into before.
Today we're talking about Heaven or Las Vegas by the Cocteau Twins.
So we usually don't have episode to episode linear narrative or connection. That's sort of the point of picking a bunch of different albums like we tend to do. But we not only have some of that this time, but I feel like this in and of itself is a pretty classic Tune Dig focused album in the sense that on one hand, we can talk all day about how interesting this piece of music is in isolation. Like we can talk about the thing itself, but then it's another one of those Morty's mind blowers of downstream impact on everything, where it's like we could basically fill 12 hours talking both about the thing itself and then every other cool thing that we started noticing that happened probably as a result of this album existing at all. And it makes me love our ability to connect a few dots in a particular moment in time in the 90s from Jeff Buckley to this one, but be able to speak to the outsized impact of two pretty different genres of music actually coming out of a similar period of time. And then we'll have some Easter eggs of literal connection between them as well, which will be nice.
What I love is that we weren't even really aware of the connection. We weren't deep in the lore for either of these artists. And we were aware of things that they did. And as we were researching, we've been texting each other a bunch like, oh my God, did you know? And we just knew that these were records. Like you see the cover and you see people that you like their music binds talking about these records over and over, just sort of universally beloved. And I've started doing the litmus now too of I'll just show the record. I'll be like in public at a thing and somebody will ask me about the podcast, which just makes me cringe out of my skin. But then it's a way to do a little bit of field research. You know what's coming up next. And then you show them the next couple of things we're talking about. People like buckled at the knees when I showed them the album cover. They were like, oh my God, this record. So there's almost a religious fervor around Heaven or Las Vegas, more broadly around the Cocteau Twins. But it's just so interesting that this deep in the game, we're still finding stuff where we know it's big, but we just haven't opened that door in the endless hallway yet. And now we do. And it's a huge room like in Encanto. So I'm excited to walk around inside for a little bit together.
Yeah, speaking of cringing out of my skin, having public conversations about music.
Is that the title of your stand-up? your Netflix hour?
When I left my
Speaking
skin.
of cringing out of my skin. What's the deal with social cues?
Have you guys seen this? Have you heard of this? Feeling weird in public? Have you done this? I'm realizing now, you phrasing it this way, I already now have at least one thing that's going to activate in me like the Winter Soldier when someone mentions this album now. And a little preview of probably what we'll talk about later, because I'd love to bring this up. But it's become a recent realization of mine that this is now my canonical anti-loudness, like evidence 1A for submission into court about why the loudness wars were not only terrible, but now I also think produced music that tried to compensate for the loudness that was being produced and kept us from having records like this until probably again in the last few years when all of that shit died back down. I didn't realize that I would care about this or that somehow I would mentally connect this record to Death Magnetic, but it has happened in my brain. And I look forward to talking about that some more, especially as we talk about the songs and sounds itself.
You're saying they're opposite polarities. They're two records that are loud, and one of them tries to be loud, and this one tries to be dynamic.
Yes. With Death Magnetic being the poster child of the loudness wars, I think it helps.
Just a solid spectral block for over an hour. Yeah.
Yes, they found so many ways to be annoying as a band, and then this was one of their best ones. But yeah, just understanding a little bit more
They
about
did Lulu, and then somehow, or I don't remember which one was first, but
Right?
there
Yeah.
was two right there in sequence where it's like, what are you guys doing?
Yeah, if
Why-
we're cringing out of our skin, their story is comfortable here, bro. We're good. No, this is fine.
An almost consultant level of brutal lack of self-awareness. The finance bros of music.
How to never feel cringe by never realizing that you notice yourself feeling cringe. A story.
This is exactly the kind of discussion I know Liz Fraser would love, being a digression before we get into her music. But you need the contrast, I feel, to appreciate the softness and deeply feltness of what they're doing here.
Well, we can't launch directly into all the superlatives because that doesn't make for interesting content.
Yeah, remember the no conjecture rule? I was thinking as we were preparing the outline, we're probably about to break that shit. This is a real, this record's a real all-timer.
So, released in September of 1990, recorded in London. This is a record that we chose specifically out of the Cocteau Twins library, but also I would imagine we would just not only pluck this out of their discography and the Tune Dig calendar for this particular month, but if you wanted to touch on any of the downstream implications of dream pop, shoegaze, ethereal sounds, ambient, post-rock, like any number of things that quite frankly have become my favorite sort of subgenres of every genre.
Mm-hmm.
This is once again sort of center of that constellation. And they have a ton of great music across their library as an artist for sure. But this one in particular, I just want to state clearly, like, this is far and away my favorite. And part of it is because of the production, but I would also learn, as we do on these episodes, the whole reason we structure things this way. Not only do you learn stuff by listening to an album with a lot of intention and fresh ears, so to speak, but loading up all the context and history of how the record gets made, sometimes they'll surprise you. This one was like, oh, yes, that makes exact sense.
Yeah.
That is correct. Like
that translates.
Yes.
Yeah.
Even, and I will mention a ton of these, right? But even down to them having 10 fully recorded instrumental songs before Elizabeth Fraser began her work is like, yes, that tracks to me and matches exactly to not only what makes sense to me kind of about this music, but what makes me love it specifically. There, as a person who loves to shit just a little bit on the role of vocals and lyrics, this is music that helps me prove my point in a way that makes me feel very
I was going to say, no. Fuck you, dude. I was going to say, this is a counterpoint to everything you've ever said about it. It's probably two halves of the same truth, but it's like, no, there's a way to do it. This is, I guess, the same thing Kurt Cobain was doing, but a bit less dialed in. And we can talk about the nuances, because I've really sat and thought about this a lot, as have their fans. Clearly, there's no accident to the way that this is being conceived of, and I find it extraordinary. And as a words person, I'm really mystified by it and impressed.
This is exciting. We got a podcast now, baby. We disagree over something mildly inconsequential, in which we both agree on the larger point anyway, but we're going to talk about it for a while.
Yeah.
No, that's great.
Words are failing us. We probably have similar feelings, but we're expressing them in a different way, thus further reinforcing Liz Fraser's point with trying to avoid the English language entirely, because fuck the whole thing. Am I right?
It all sounds like gibberish to me anyway, so might as well do it on purpose and make it sound good.
Since we're doing disclaimers, I just want to reiterate my hatred of genre terminology. Dream pop is always one that has really bugged me. And this record, the Cocteau Twins in general, but this record specifically, because of its poppiness, it is fully worthy of the term dream pop, because it sounds like you're listening to a pop record in a dream where it's all a little bit out in front of you and you can't really, as soon as you try to grab at the details, they evaporate. But if you strip the whole thing back, like if somebody sang these melody lines and played the basic chord progressions, it would be great and memorable songs.
Mm-hmm.
So the genre tag really works for me here. Not going to go around using it, but I do appreciate it. It is helpful to understand what you're about to experience if somebody says, that's what this music is.
Fully agreed. And one reason I'll keep bringing up production as we go along is, for me, I can agree with you, but even just thinking about the production and how production specifically will impact a pop record, like, to me, you could at least theoretically turn a dream pop record into a non-dream pop record exclusively through production approaches, right?
Totally.
And so to me, that is why, yep, agreed. I don't want to overuse that label, but here it works. And it has the dreamy popness of it, has an expression that you can sort of point at, and has some different, like, pieces of the elephant that you can actually describe and see a whole of why it sounds good. Point being, I feel like if this record were made or produced in the midst of the loudness wars, like I mentioned, so 10 to 15 years ago, the vocals and other aspects of the instrumentation would be so forward that it would not have the washy feeling and sensation that this record specifically has.
Mm-hmm.
And for me personally, that makes all of the difference in when I want to listen to pop records or not.
The layers would flatten and it would be like overpaint. Yeah. You really critically need space with the amount of like chaining and layering of effects that's happening here.
Yeah. And to me, this is sort of a sibling conversation to our Olivia Rodrigo episode, because we not only talked about being surprised by the quality of the music on Sour in general, but we talked a lot about the production and why it sounds good and how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And like, that's another record that's a good example of, at least from my anecdotal or personal experience of the record, like the balancing of the instrumentation brings out the overall like emotion of the songs that are actually written. They feel more intense to me, more immersive, because especially when it comes to vocals, when they are properly aligned with all of that other ethereal sounding reverberation, whatever else is happening, it feels like one cohesive story being told, as opposed to, a lot of pop records to me feel like a singular person performing with some background people doing music to it. Like, if that makes enough sense, like, to me, that's really the hard to express quality.
Karaoke. It's like a
great, yes,
a processed thing that then somebody consumes or whatever. Yeah. What I found really interesting about that, unlike so many other artists, the band has a huge website and it's got a glossary of terminology. It's got all sorts of interviews. It's got stuff about gear. It's got all the press that's ever been written around lyrics or lack thereof or whatever. It's just like, it's a tremendously good repository that I would love to see from more legacy artists. So kudos to the team that puts it together and maintains it. One of the scores of articles on there is an interview with Robin Guthrie where he talks about how each track in the song is a recorded effect. And he talks about how he's not a really good guitar player. So like sometimes he'll do a single notey thing and then start building and bouncing. I didn't think about the elements being that thin or minimal or singular. Getting from there to the huge sounding things that you're hearing on this record is an enormous journey and makes me applaud what's happening even more. I mean, the dude literally said, I wouldn't know a D flat from a B major, which is very much in the school of Gary Arce from Yawning Man, who just like does stuff with his hands, or Jay Mascis from Dinosaur Jr., who was just making up chord fingerings. And to be able to do almost perverse amateurishness and land at something cool and novel, it's like, well, of course, eventually you would land at something different, but to make it sound different and cool is a huge thing. So the level of innovation on display here goes all the way down to the basis musical elements, which I find really exciting.
Totally. I mean, Robin Guthrie, so just to set it up clearly, so he is producing this record. He's primarily the guitarist, but to really bring home immediately, Kyle, what you were just saying, Like this is sort of it's like a knee jerk. Oh, Cocteau Twins, like classic synth records. Like actually a shocking amount of the music on this album is just guitar being channeled through, rack unit after rack unit, effects processing after effects processing, building, and creating a bunch of layers of things, to the degree that to some extent this record especially the guitar playing has more in common with King Tubby meets Rockers Uptown than it does most of the other guitar-based music that we talk about, which is the thing that makes it sound and feel synthy.
Another Jeff Buckley connection. It's a guitar record that you didn't know you should refer to as a guitar record, for sure.
So speaking of that, two really great connections, I think, between our just previous episode on Jeff Buckley and this one. One is the boneheaded one that's just worth mentioning, but the other I think is a little more deeper and conceptual and aligns to how we're trying to approach music and trying to help other people approach music too. So one is just, yes, eventually Elizabeth Fraser, vocalist of Cocteau Twins, would be in a relationship with Jeff Buckley and would go on to write about that in future music, and did a duet with Jeff before his death. And they had a relationship. It played out. I don't think that should or did have a super influential or important chunk of meaning relative to what we should discuss about this record.
The only digression that I would probably account for is she is a huge self-admitted fan of Tim Buckley, and I know there's a whole complicated relationship there, but I think there's a spiritual, like, I heard a voice in Jeff and felt a spirit that I have always been drawn to. There's a very cosmic essence to Liz Fraser and the way she moves through she's very artist in that way, like big old feels. So yeah, there's I don't want to call it tabloid stuff, but yeah, there's the stuff that this podcast tries to not concern itself with. That's there a little bit. And that people have asked her about pretty exhaustively at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah. So it's worth noting, so that we can say we know about it, but we're intentionally not talking about it. We are the same duo who brought you an Alice Coltrane episode in which we were like, yeah, so the fact that she was with John Coltrane is basically not important here. Yeah. So let's just set that to the side and talk about a mammoth record. So similarly here, there's a lot more to talk about, especially because in the timing of this album, Guthrie and Fraser had just had their first child, and it was a newborn here, which we'll talk some more about the pretty heavy stuff that was going on for everybody in this band during recording that I think helped produce the thickness of this record. But on a lighter note, I just wanted to call this out because I really enjoyed this discussion from last time. I usually don't get all like meta talking about our previous discussions, but like all
right, cool out, Dan Harmon.
Sorry. In that Jeff Buckley episode, one of the things we talked about is paying attention to your favorite artist, right? And in this moment, yes, we have a direct Chappell Roan reference for that whole meme, yes. But that's been going on for a long time.
R.I.P. Jeff Buckley, you would have loved Chappell Roan.
We can draw a line between anyone. But
that's why we're great at bars. Give me 2 faraway endpoints and some hot wings. I got you, baby.
Yes, Cliff, famously good at extroverted conversations with strangers in bars. Yes. But we talked a lot about paying attention with your favorite artist. And for Jeff Buckley, like that's, that was folks like Jimmy Page and things like that. Here, there is a lot of love for Cocteau Twins, but like one of them that was pretty immediate to pull out, Prince. Like Prince unabashedly liked this band a lot. He replicated it through music, both at the time and then through the 2014 release of Tic Tac Toe. Like there are several songs that are kind of direct aping that he didn't really hide when someone would ask him about it. And then additionally, he tried to sign them as a band to his own label.
By the way, doing stuff like directly or indirectly from other artists was very much not Prince's thing, just to put a finer point on it.
Right, because who was doing something he hadn't already done or thought of?
Right.
So this is another example of like, okay, I was already on board, but I'm going to lock in pretty hard. If Prince is paying so much attention to what was done, especially in the early 90s iterations of what this band was cranking out.
Just the fact that he literally said, what I like is stuff that I can't do and I would never do, like the Cocteau Twins. I would never do that.
Another quote he had, though, which I think can take us directly into sort of what it feels like to try to listen to this again with fresh ears and to start tying together some of the references we've already made about vocal approaches and the sounds and all this stuff. He said, quote, "You can't understand the words of Cocteau Twins songs, but their harmonies put you in a dreamlike state." And like, yep. I mean, we could kind of put the podcast down now if we were being irresponsible or if we were only looking for Prince quotes to end everything that we were talking about. But that's a pretty good, I think, summation of at least one way to experience this record and kind of understand what it's sending in your way when you're listening.
I think about the essence of the Erykah Badu episode where we were talking about how her sort of unstated mission statement is to raise vibrations, it's like elevated consciousness. That this is more like out than up. I think it is intended to be a consciousness shifter for themselves or otherwise, but more like diffuse to capture the bigness of consciousness. So dreamlike state is perfect, but don't think of yourself falling asleep and having a movie playing. Like, think of your senses being really diffuse and beyond your ability to catch them.
I love how you said that. Sorry. It's no matter how long we do this together, man, it still excites me when we start saying things and it's like, oh, that's exactly what I was thinking about when I was listening. So it's still, man, it just gets me stoked. But okay, that is a great way, I think, to talk about what surprised me when, this wasn't my first time hearing this record. I've heard it plenty, but we always take this approach when picking an album and we focus on it and we give it active attention. And one of the exercises we try to do is just giving it a sort of new ear listen and just notice what surprises you. And specifically related to what you were just saying, when we talk about it being dreamlike, one thing I noticed specifically is that despite the songs being a pretty normal length, they never overstay their welcome. There's no slow ramp up. There's not a lot of instrumental interludes that feel like they're spacing out the songs. There's not a lot of repetition that feels like it's unnecessary. The songs like pretty much end immediately once the melody itself is done for the last time. Like, there's no long play out. There's no ethereal interlude. And in that sense, it has an uncanny dreamlike quality in that dreams somehow always feel like they just stop at this really weird time. Like, it sort of completes.
And you always become aware of them in the middle. So you get dropped right into the main idea, which is what these songs do. And Robin Guthrie talking about like they're all built around an effect. And then I start building layers outward from there. It's like a fish is my teacher in my 11th grade class. That's what track 5 is. Fish is my teacher. And then track 7 is I'm seeing the Northern Lights on another planet and another timeline or whatever. They're distinctive, but they do drop you right in. That's what lends itself to, this is a pop record. There's no bullshit. You're right into the main idea and they get going, they cook on a dynamic and then they leave. It's like borderline Chuck Berry-ish in that way.
Oh yeah.
It's very focused. So great on you. Good point there.
Yeah. I mean, that just really stood out to me, especially again, coming off of a conversation about a Jeff Buckley record where I personally talked about how it felt hard to kind of click into it for me for whatever reason.
Because there is so much build and wandering and dynamic on that record. Yeah.
Which, I'm a mono Explosions in the Fan Sky or Explosions in the Sky fan. There we go.
Did you know there's an Explosions in the Sky connection to this band other than sonically?
No.
Yeah, here we go. I wanted to talk about Bella Union when we got to the last part. And obviously we can revisit that. But Explosions in the Sky is a Bella Union band. It is, or at some point was.
Yeah.
So they're part of this tree.
That tracks. Man, that's cool. Yeah, Explosions in the Sky, mono. Sigur Rós, which I think we'll also mention later, has a connection. Like, I love a good build. I'm a big fan of it. But in the wrong context or in a particular type of genre, especially, for me, it's hard to click into. This one, opposite. I mean, 5 seconds into the first track, anytime I was doing a full album playthrough, or even, I try to mix it up sometimes and play things in different orders or see what comes out. We love the classic play it in reverse trick to see what happens. Every single time I was locked in immediately, no matter what I was doing. And it was just a difficult to describe quality, but that I love having a stupid podcast where I can verbalize to other people, like, yeah, sometimes music doesn't work. This one did. You should keep trying it, because sometimes things just click into place that you would have never expected.
That is a really excellent point, because I'm sitting here thinking about all the times in the past few weeks where I was like, I don't want to listen to that right now. I'm not in the mood for that kind of thing. And then I'd be like, well, just do it. So you like think about it for 30 minutes today. It's also a pretty lean record. It's 37 minutes.
Yeah.
So it gets in and out, and then doesn't overstay its welcome, certainly. But like within 30 seconds of putting the record on, like right away with Cherry Colored Funk, you're like, okay, your muscles relax a little. You feel yourself kind of, your whole body loosens up with it. And you're right, it is immediate. If there had been a bunch of build, or it had some of the sparseness of their earlier stuff, the coldness, the post-punkiness, it wouldn't have pulled me in as fast. But yeah, the lushness really gets you no matter what mood you're in. To that point, we'd also be remiss if we didn't point out that this is their 6th full album. And they'd been a band since 79. And I can't think of that many artists that their 6th, 7th, 8th record is the consensus favorite among fans and casual listeners. So there's a bit of a unique quality to this group because they hit a stride or had a moment or a breakthrough. I even think about, I've talked about Every Time I Die as a personal favorite band on this podcast before, and how people generally acknowledge that they got better and tighter as they went along. But there's always going to be a camp that's like, they're from 2003, the early stuff, man. and there's definitely people in the camp of liking the early 80s stuff, lower register Liz Fraser, sort of a different approach to the sound. But I think if you polled 100 people who like this band, you clear 90 of them that would say, yeah, start with Heaven or Las Vegas, which is so interesting to me. And like the early 80s stuff, you can hear the starts of things on Lullabies in the early 80s. There's cool, like different vocal rhythms. And then you do the records right around this one, Bluebell Knoll before it, and Four Calendar Cafe right after it. And both of those are really good records. Like, we could easily, if this record had never existed, we could easily talk about either of those other two and be like, wow, this group was really great. But it's immediately apparent from the first notes of Cherry Colored Funk. And they've said this in retrospectives. They knew when they did that instrumental, like, oh, we're on to something. I really looked for stuff about, like, did you know how did you make it more special? Were there influences that went into this? And I guess that's the point you're going to get into in a bit. It's just real life informed a special energy that they brought to the creation of this stuff.
Yep. I think that energy plus their literal approach to recording and production produces this kind of unique combination of things that we haven't seen a ton, because it's pretty hard to get that combination of extremely talented tight-knit group of musicians who are also, once again, at least one of them is an extraordinarily talented producer. When you get those kind of moments, it's an easy call out is the band Converge, right? When one of your members is an actual audio engineer, you have a different layer to draw out entirely.
It's worth mentioning that 4AD, their label, tried to get Brian Eno to produce a couple of their records before this, and he literally said, "No, they're good. They got it."
Eno, thanks. Great stuff.
But if that doesn't mean anything to you now, go to Brian Eno's Wikipedia page. We've mentioned him a number of times, but go look at all the stuff he has been involved with, much of which was an influence on this band. Like he worked with John Cale, the Talking Heads, Devo, Bowie, would go on to work with U2. And maybe if he'd worked with Cocteau Twins, we wouldn't have been subjected to U2 in the 80s. You and I have different feelings about that. But
do we?
They did go on to work. Yeah, snuck that one in. They did go on to work with Harold Budd later in the 80s, who was a collaborator of Eno's, worked on Ambient 2. And like one of my favorite ambient records ever is called Pavilion of Dreams by Harold Budd. They did a record with him in 86. There's a cut above from their peers thing because they were venturing off into new directions. So like we would do a disservice to try to talk too much about the history. Unfortunately, I haven't seen enough of the history and context around this group in one place, perhaps outside of their website. But I've grown more fascinated with them as we've started to look more closely. And, this is yet another group that they are great in part because the family tree around them or the 6 degrees around them are like so much good recorded music in the history of music.
For sure. So another thing that stood out to me on reactive listening to this one was, we already kind of talked about the downstream connection to a million genres, artists, ideas, whatever that would be heavily inspired by this band and this particular record. But even I, a person who is pretty selective about the pop adjacent stuff I listen to and am familiar with, even I immediately on first listen was drawing out specific moves in the song and mapping them back to other artists. I heard FKA Twigs directly on one of the songs. One of the tracks, Ice Blink Luck, reminds me of the band Churches and Lauren Mayberry. And like, I'm not a huge Churches fan across that whole discography, but I've always appreciated a lot about their approach. Some of the songs I really love, and they were really fun to see in concert. But like the Churches song "Leave a Trace," like if you can't hear Cocteau Twins directly from that song, I don't know, listen again and believe me, I guess. And then even 50/50 Clown, which is a pretty cool song in and of itself. The ending had voices on it that, speaking of the Olivia Rodrigo record, reminded me of a move off of Sour. Sometimes we can, you mentioned the no conjecture rule. We don't want to draw lines where we know that they don't exist. But some of these are like, nah, you were listening to this while you recorded that other album. And that's awesome. Like that's that blues spirit playing out through all types of music and pervading everything like the inverse of a cancer, where we can all borrow the coolest moves from one another and keep recreating into something totally different that then inspires other people. So especially if you are even close to like a pop or indie pop aficionado of any sort, make sure you've heard this record recently because it will feel familiar. And I think that's going to be cool for a lot of people who aren't like me and know a lot more about different genres of music than I do.
There are moments where it ventures into, like FKA Twigs is a cool example, and you draw it back to Prince. 50/50 Clown, the first time I really listened to it was like, this could be an R&B song. Like if you put real lyrics on this, the progression of this could be 2000 or later R&B song for sure. And 50/50 Clown is the one that people compared that song Love Thy Will Be Done that Prince wrote originally for Martika. Olivia Rodrigo herself could probably turn it into a cool R&B-ish thing, or a number of artists could. And I have a whole dense paragraph of people that, like, if you're picking up what they're putting down as pop artists on this, boy, do I have a block of new things for you to go listen to. This is actually, now that I'm thinking about it, this and Jeff Buckley are two that we should probably make playlists for. Probably just needs to be a standard. We're thinking out loud here. Brainstorm happening in real time, people. There needs to be a standard recommended if you like. We're always talking shit about algorithms. Let's put our money where our mouth is and do the weird connections that you might not have expected playlist.
Whatever. I stand firmly in my stance that we kick the algorithm's ass in most cases and throw its dead body behind the dumpster. So our ability to, yes, I'm excited to just get to that part of the episode and talk about it. Because, yeah, like the Jeff Buckley episode, instead of trying to condense what's happening in this album into a singular thing that then guides you along a singular trajectory through other related music, like we like firmly stand against this with religious fervor, like go in every direction instead. Like look in all of the places and look for all the things that surprise you and delight you that you wouldn't have expected otherwise, because there are a million rabbit holes to go down. And it's a
deeply held belief for me hanging around musicians that they don't think about it the way that listeners do. There's less linearity. They're pulling inspiration from more disparate places than often they let on. And so I think we're trying to offer connections, more cosmic connections, like the musicians themselves would want to be acknowledged or explored. It's really like inspiration begets more inspiration. You know, it's got a multiplier effect. We've talked about that before. So the mark of a good album for us to talk about is the size of the ripples and the space between them. If the more different they are, but you can clearly draw some kind of connection still, the more worth talking about it is. And I think you'll continue to see lots more of that from us in the future.
Was there anything else that surprised you when you were listening to it fresh?
I feel two things. I feel one, like Simon Raymond gets overlooked a lot in this conversation about Guthrie and Liz Fraser, and in a bit of a give the drummer some moment. The bass is a very important element of this record that, like, I just did not see talked about enough. And bass in the way that, like, John Paul Jones was frequently not acknowledged enough as the backbone of Led Zeppelin. There's, like, if you watch Zeppelin videos and he's doing the bass with his feet, the synth bass on like a no quarter type song, there's a lot of that kind of feeling bass. And it propels things, it accents things. Like, everything is built around the guitar / synth layer, the mostly guitar stuff, right? But the bass either warms it up or it accents it. So really listen for that, and listen on a good pair of speakers where you can pick up the low end really nicely, because it's pretty mid-range and trebly.
Yep, agreed.
Without the right set of speakers. The other thing that I'll say, you know, a lot's been said about the lyrics or lack thereof, or the multiple languages, or all the stuff about Liz Fraser, but cadences of delivery and runs of notes are like two things I think she does really uniquely. So the cadence on something like I Wear Your Ring, it's not how I would have put a vocal line in that instrumental. And I found multiple instances of that as I was listening. She just makes really unique choices around places she puts rhythmic emphasis and runs. So not just like weird keys or weird sequences of notes, but she does these little flitters that are totally inimitable. Nobody else could do them. And if somebody else tried, you'd be like, oh, that's a Liz Fraser thing for sure. You really hear it in the first time that I ever noticed it was the Fearless on My Breath line in Teardrop by Massive Attack. And like, oh my God, who's that singing? Before I'd ever listened to the Cocteau Twins, you know, I'd heard that song. But in Ice Blink Luck, she does like a trilling thing almost, that it's like, whoa, holy shit, how do you even do that with your voice? It's a little bit operatic, it's a little bit Björk, it's a little bit punk or post-punk atonal, but it's really beautiful, and it seems impossible to pull off. I am not a great singer, but I certainly can't make my voice approach anything near that. There's a deftness to it that is just, I find really, really impressive. And it seems natural, effortless, effervescent. Like it just seems like that was in her, and that's just how she sings around the house almost. There's a lightness to it. And I found myself, like, you can't hone in on any of the lyrics, but I found myself often being like, what's she going to do next? You know, like what John Bonham playing drums to make another Zeppelin connection. It's like fill to fill, line to line. I don't really know what's going to happen, and it's thrilling.
I liked your Björk reference there. I think this record draws out one of the two sides of Björk that has gotten channeled into popular music since she existed. To me, there are a million ways to classify this, right? But the side of Björk that everyone seemed to adopt is the side that points towards like Regina Spektor and stuff, where people are like, I am small. Hello, here I am. And like, oh, okay, that works. And that became like a much more...
I'm wearing a goose.
And I feel like that became the move for verses on pop songs, and then they would, dive back into the lush hook in a chorus. And but like every verse would sort of fall back to this minimalist sort of voice forward thing, which first of all, Björk did and does in an inhuman way much better than other people who even attempt to imitate it. But on the other side of it, like if you can even just think of the line emotional landscape, a lot of people do the landscape part of Björk, but don't do the emotional part, where she is just directly on note, directly ethereal, in with the music, designed to give you a very clear melody line. Like that aspect of it, in my opinion, gets sort of under-aped in subsequent records. This record is a great example of that approach to vocalization, where it is, no, I'm going to slot in here, and yes, it will often be melody, but sometimes it's harmony, or sometimes you can't really tell who's carrying the melody or what part is harmony, because it's all one kind of bigger mishmash of things together. And because we keep running all of these signals through effects units that are building layers on top of it, the Venn diagram is no longer a series of three circles. Like, we don't know where the edges are because things are bleeding into one another. And
she stacks vocals like in the round with herself, yes. Like overlapping phrasings in addition to harmony stacks. Like I want to emphasize that the more you sit with her delivery, it's very clear she's not making up a language or doing baby talk, or like sometimes she's sneaking in a little bit more Scottish or Old English or whatever of clear words that are pulled. But it's like, what if I stripped all of the hardness away from words with discrete admissible meanings? But like, it's not, it seems like a lazy thing or an avoidance thing, but it's perfect. Yeah. It's not too loose. And it's not too, like, she didn't make up Klingon for it and only sing in this specific language.
Yeah.
And that's what gives it its dreamy quality, because it's recognizable and real, but it's not literal and linear.
Yeah.
And that's extraordinary. Think about not only conceptualizing to nail a middle ground like that and evade either of those ends of the spectrum, but to be able to do it and then fucking remember it, to be able to sing it the same way twice is like, my brain could never do that in a million years.
When I was learning to sing in a choral setting when I was younger, like one of the things they would teach us was, if you don't know the words, sing Watermelon. Mm-hmm. Because Watermelon will look approximately like you know what you're doing and won't sound terrible. And it's sort of like, well, what if you joined a chorus and then you made up your own part with Watermelon and it sounded so good that they were like, wait a minute, let's make that the main thing that we're going to do. And we'll just kind of focus on that because it doesn't really matter that you're not saying what we were trying to say to begin with. We'll get enough of the point, but you just keep doing what you're doing. You just vibe it out. If you want to use some of the words, you can. If not, just the fact that we're approximately in the same location as the words will do just fine. And it just works so well.
But it's like she learned Watermelon in 14 languages and uses them all on the record.
Well, as someone who works in corporate America during the week, that sort of skill does come in handy. You can just sort of like say watermelonish things back to people and they're like, yes, ROI,
wow.
ROI, great meeting. Yeah.
Give this guy a promotion.
Yeah, I'm going to put this on LinkedIn. Here's what Watermelon teaches me about B2B sales.
Send this podcast episode to your favorite vest wearing B2B sales friend.
I have one in mind.
And then afterward, ask yourself, why are they your friend?
Because we might as well make this turn as dramatic as humanly possible. I think it's worth noting without belaboring the point, a couple of like serious things that were happening in real time during the recording of this record. And I think it's important to bring this up for two reasons. One is because, well, the context of an album is always something that we try to bring forward as much as we can. Not people talking or projecting onto the record, but like what were things that were actually happening then that the artists themselves say influenced it. So I think it's important to know from that perspective. But from another, I think this will be a good example of actually not overthinking the meaning of music. And that's great. Thank you, podcast that's 2 hours long every episode about a fucking album, for telling me not to overthink it. But like, there were some really heavy things that were happening then, but I don't think, and I don't see any reason to believe that that darkness is the only thing that produced the outcome of what people love about this record.
As the B2B sales guys would say, it's a data point, not the data point.
We cannot keep this theme going in a meta sense across all of our episodes.
Can we circle back on what was happening in the studio?
Yeah. So two things. First of all, like I mentioned a minute ago when we discussed, Elizabeth Fraser and Robin Guthrie had just had a newborn. So there is a child between the two of these people that is less than a year old. And as Kyle knows personally, and I only know anecdotally, that first year seems pretty busy and difficult.
It's psychotic and psychedelic. It's insane. I mean, it felt like I was on drugs for a whole year straight, honestly.
Every person who I love, well, I'll say it that way. Every person who I love who has been through that experience describes it in some capacity like that. Like It is the most everything and the most terrible all at once, somehow wrapped into the same thing. And my capacity for enduring the terribleness and my capacity for like expansion all were there at the same moment. And I found out I was a superhuman.
When everyone's like, yeah, you're never the same after you have kids. Like, yeah, because it breaks your fucking brain, dude. Like you just fundamentally are not the same physiologically anymore. One, because apparently biological things happen, but two, because you are in the trenches. You are experiencing the middle of the night in different ways more than you ever anticipated that you would. You're sitting there thinking about your friends doing last call at a place out in public. And you're like, oh God, I'm here. I have throw up on me.
So that was happening for two of the three people in this band. And on top of that, one of them, Robin Guthrie, being, the person who is more or less taking single vibes and building them into massive songs. Like this is what is happening in his brain and body during that time period. At the same time, while they were in the studio, Simon Raymond's dad died in the middle of all of this. And
you're getting the whole circle of life in one creative burst.
Yeah. And and maybe we'll mention this a little bit later too, but like we know that had a direct impact, and that's worth bringing up because Simon even mentioned that in his own words, quote, "After my dad died, I couldn't even grieve properly, and I arrived back at the studio early the day after the funeral and began playing the piano, and by the time Robin arrived, Frou Frou Foxes and Midsummer Fires was pretty much done." Like, so we know from an objective standpoint, from the source, this song was written in grief. Like, this is a grief song. And while it has some sort of spiritual connections to the scenario Jeff Buckley had in his Discovery, which we talked about last episode, where, in the shadow of your father dying, you're able to emerge with something artistic and beautiful. In the same vein, I mean, this is heaviness personified in this moment across an entire group of people who are experiencing life's highest joys and lowest griefs all at once, all while once again producing their 6th record as a well-known group of people who are, experiencing a pretty intense moment in their lives. And I do think it's worth mentioning as well that a lot of times when we cover moments like this for artists, this is it. This is the end. Or at the very least, this is the penultimate moment where they're like, I've only got one more thing in me before I'm done with this forever. They would go on to have, like, this was the top of the bell curve for them. Mm-hmm. They made it through this in other ways. And yeah, it is an amazing testament to whatever they believed that they had between one another musically. And it's nice to be able to validate that in retrospect now, because it's magical.
And when you filter everything through the next record, 4 Calendar Cafe, that came out, I think 3 full years later, they're in parenthood. Robin Guthrie is still dealing with substance abuse issues, which like kind of feels tawdry to talk about, but
yeah,
there's a totally different air on that record. Somebody mentioned the influence of Can on Susie and the Banshees, who were like a spiritual ascendant of this band. And I think maybe there was a direct link of some kind to Cocteau Twins, but it reminded me, I was trying to find an analogy in my mind for the difference in vibe between Heaven in Las Vegas and 4 Calendar Cafe. And it felt like the jump from Tagomago to Future Days, where they'd gone maximalist and they'd had this sort of like big moment. And then they almost sort of had to exhale it. And there was a calm, a steadiness after. And I know it goes deeper than that because it like was fraught and the band only had a few more years before they collapsed under the weight of themselves. But you can point to, if you do the Dewey Cox, like, how can I tell the story of this band that lasted a really long time? You can point to things that are kind of tropes that exist at other places, but their story is really kind of unique.
Yeah.
And there's just so much feeling between them that all came out in the music in a unique way. And, they were supposed to reunite for Coachella in 2005 and it didn't happen, specifically because, or at least partly because, Liz Fraser felt the full weight of those relationships and how they went into the music. So all that to say, when you hear the thickness, when you hear the emotiveness of the bends of the vocal sounds, when you hear the dynamics between the major and minor shifts, through something like the bass, especially, they're putting all that in there, but not in a literal way. I think the gift of the Cocteau Twins was I've been thinking a lot about that, like, units of information thing that we talked about with Jeff Buckley last episode. Mm-hmm. They found a way to compress it into pure dreamlike energy. Another Rick and Morty reference, like the thing, like, we took the memory of the best day you ever had with your daughter and we put it into a dessert snack. They could kind of do that with feeling for real in music in a way that is like kind of touching at the sublime.
Yeah. I mean, even just one more data point to support what you're pointing out here. You mentioned, 4 Calendar Cafe. the band themselves would say that that record was itself a response to this period of time in which there was a whole lot going on, which would get worse before it got better. But point being that by that time, they were on the other side of Guthrie having gone through rehab successfully, which is itself a pretty unique story point for an artist. Usually that doesn't take, the first few times for people. But he made it through. And then Fraser, by their own, statements, had gone through psychotherapy to help repair some of the things that she was going through. Like there was a connective tissue together between these folks that they valued clearly. It wasn't a regrettable thing.
Sorry, not to make light of that moment, because that is a deeply earnest and meaningful point. But I was just thinking about how you invoked Metallica at the beginning of this episode, and I want to go create a Wikipedia category page of bands that went to therapy together. Drop other examples in the comments.
Name things that can, through music culture, trigger you. Nothing like mentioning that exact video. I've never gone from being neutral on someone to hating them as fast as I did when I saw that video of Metallica. Anyway, incredible.
Songs that are about your mom, whether you know it or not. One thing I did want to ask you about, because you're one of my favorite gearheads, like there's a clear, studio as an instrument, the city as a character type thing going on here with Robin Guthrie. Was there any aspect of that intrigued you, or that you dialed into, or that you learned about and found interesting?
Mostly, I would say that the more I learned about Robin Guthrie and his technique and approach here, the more it rooted and supported this growing thing as I try to be more and more of a student of music itself and the history.
As I live and breathe.
As I live and breathe. The people who have the best musical ideas are not consciously thinking of them in the way that we experience it once we're done. And like, maybe that sounds boneheaded. I don't know. But like, it's sort of like, maybe it's just going from a childlike mindset into more of an adult understanding of things. But, when you hear music that really kind of takes your breath away and you go, how do they even get there? And then you read and learn a little bit more about the musicians themselves. And you realize, they've been doing this forever. They've been working together. They do this every day. You sort of get this implication in you that, for instance, Robin Guthrie sat down and picked 10 different things to do and then did them. Just like he sat down, he did them. He knew what he would do, and then he did them, and then it was done. And then maybe people added embellishments or whatever, but it was, it was that sort of third eye clarity directly on the place where they would get to, and then they just know how to make their way there. When I mentioned earlier that it feels like this has more to do with King Tubby than it does like guitar effects in general, like the more I understood that everything here was a journey that started with something extremely uncomplicated. Guthrie would remind everyone of that on a regular basis and continues to this day, down to the fact that like when he gets interviewed talking about guitar tones, he would mostly willingly brag, especially nowadays, about how he was like, well, I just play like $150 Squier now because they're like significantly better in quality than the super expensive guitars that we had back then that took all this work to set up and sound good. And he was like he just has this LOL nothing matters vibe to his approach to music. And he doesn't even talk about his time during this record as if it's like sacred or he had these magical ideas. Like every time he would talk more in detail, it was just like, oh yeah, this thing, got curious, piped it through some things, thought about it, ended up in a place. And then the addition of 2 other people took it to this mountaintop every single time.
There is a sound on sound interview with him that speaks to exactly what you just said. He said, we don't write songs as such. We come in here, put down all our ideas on the tape machine once, and then we mix and that's it. There's no demoing or anything like that. We're very sort of down to earth about it. A lot of musicians fantasize that there's some sort of artistic notion that goes into their music. I don't understand that. To me, if it sounds good, use it. I don't think about it. When a lot of people hear music, then they go and say, it makes me think of such and such, as if that's what we're thinking about when we made it. But
shit, yeah.
I'm just thinking of which plug goes in which hole.
I had not seen this quote when I was trying to express this idea.
Yeah. So he totally validated with evidence. And they asked him, can you recreate one for one the things that you do in the studio? Can you take a piece of machinery apart and put it back together and create a certain effect? He said, no, that's going a bit far. What's helped is that when I first walked into the studio, I knew how to fix a module before I knew how to operate it. And that comes from his work in Grangemouth on an oil refinery, like deedling around with buttons and stuff. The shoegaze industry. He said, all these different units, I like making them do more than the average person would. Take a reverb, for instance. Most people would put it on the snare drum, but me, I then put it through a chorus and then compress it and just keep going. I'm not into this purist idea of what a drum machine should sound like or what a guitar should sound like. With me, it's, I wonder what would happen if I put this in there and here. So you absolutely nailed it. That validated by first person evidence.
Hell yeah. To draw out, though, the kind of surprising other side of that same kind of realization, his attack on the guitar is fundamentally different than how most people play guitar. And that was something that I thought that I started noticing, but you can produce your way towards a lower attack sensation, if that makes sense. You can play the guitar however you sort of want and then produce your way to the thing. But it felt different. And then eventually I stumbled across a quote where he said, my technique for playing the instrument is very, very gentle and very, very soft. He talks about how a lot of people that try to play music with a lot of effects, they're really overdoing the playing part, which is like an absurd sentence. But he says they really overdo the playing part. I'm not playing a guitar. I'm playing the sound. I'm playing the pedals. I'm playing the reverb. My touch is based upon what I'm hearing, which makes me guess he's probably been a good lover to people in the past as well. But got Kyle with that one. He's on the floor.
In all my years, I've never heard you make a musical comparison like that. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a new therapy breakthrough live and on the air.
My touch is based upon what I'm hearing is a very good methodology to take into a lot of things.
I'm sorry. The next time I see your wife, I need to ask her directly in the face. Did you know guitar playing inspired your love life?
The answer may surprise you.
Honestly, with your wife, nothing surprises me, and that's what I love about her.
We'll record this moment.
Everything's
put
a
it up on
surprise, so nothing is.
So my, speaking of cringing out of my skin, so my awkward statements about this aside, like that though is...
You made it weird.
That's my job. That approach is shockingly impactful. And once I started thinking through the implications of that and listening to it, that sort of opened up a new way of sort of intellectualizing this record, which you don't have to do with every piece of music. But sometimes I like to feel like I understand why I like what I'm listening to. And hearing it expressed that way helped me to get it, because that also to me aligns very closely to what Elizabeth Fraser is doing with her vocals. Not only with the style itself, but with this glossolalia concept of like nonsensical syllables and all this stuff as part of singing. It is not the playing of the instrument. They are not overdoing the playing of the particular instrument in any case. They are using an effect that they're playing and using their guitar, voice, whatever, to ride out whatever it is that they think that they're seeing or feeling in that effect. And to me, that thinking about that and putting those pieces together sort of unlocked like, oh, that's why I love this record. These things work together on purpose because they were meant to work together because they built it that way. It's like an asynchronous little waterfall type process in which they end up with something very predictable every time if you know the ingredients that went into it to begin with. And like that just to be able to draw out why you love a sound is, to me, a really cool thing to experience in music, and something that I think is one of the reasons we like to encourage people to like just nerd out on this shit, get better at listening to music. Because like when you start to think about and experience things and understand them at a deeper level, like you are becoming an expert in what you're experiencing, and like the depth of what you can do from there just grows. And so like this was just another one of those moments for me where like I had conscious appreciation of the exercise of listening to music like this that we do together.
The designed waterfall imagery, it really resonates with me. It is not a novel concept to talk about alchemy between people in a musical group and how the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But, and this is specifically important because they record separately, or they were by this point. So they're bringing completed pieces and adding to them. So the effect that they get from the completed piece is even more interesting because it seems designed to be alchemic. It seems designed to weave in and out of each other's space, but that just shows how dialed in they were with each other by this point. You know, personal stuff aside, they knew how to work with each other's stuff and carve out an emotional landscape. And that's so cool to me because the other 999,999,000 whatever artists try to do that and can't. So that's a special potent chemistry that they can make it look like it was woven when it was in fact stacked.
I hate myself for this, but it's maybe the best example of a true yes and exercise. Trusting through musicians, like it's literally whatever it is you did. Yes.
For those listening at home, we did B2B sales, we did improv. Wow, we just need one more to complete the punch card of the worst people you've ever met in your life. Stick around to see if we can do it.
One of the truly unexpected experiences, I think, of mine and Kyle's life are being us inside of way larger companies than we necessarily ever expected to work with or inside of, which means we both encounter some of the world's best people.
And just having a job in general, if we're being honest.
100%. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Without going too far into our individual stories, yes, that itself would shock many people. But being exposed to not only the best people in the world, but also, wow. Yes. You cannot put 100,000 people in a room and not have a significant percentage of them be the types of people who don't understand the joke behind the B2B sales reference.
And if you think otherwise, buddy, do I have a cult to sell you?
So bringing forward another one of our exercises that we like to do is we talked about things that surprise you on sort of fresh ears, active listening, and all that. Another one we like to do then is, subsequent listens from there. We're locked in. We sort of have our initial viewpoint on it or our feeling or vibe coming into it. And now it's just like kind of repetition. Well, what can you focus on? What happens when you listen to different things or pay attention to different aspects of the music that you're listening to so you can draw out bits of it and all that stuff. So what did you find was interesting or fun to focus on or isolate or sort of do with listening?
Layers, just straight up, like, especially once I knew what an album of layers by design this was, instead of a swirling ice cream of delights. A few that I really liked were there is a strobing effect right in the middle of the mix of Pitch the Baby that I liked. And it reminded me of there's a little keyboard flourish in Sippin' on Some Syrup by 3 6 Mafia, which is not a comparison I can imagine many people have made before. But it's one of those details that once you hear it, it is the main thing you hear, but not in a grating way, in a way that you're like, oh, I like that sound. It's like pleasing to my psyche. In Wolf in the Breast, Liz does a vocal bend up that's then echoed by a little, very almost country-ish guitar slide up. And it's like blink if you miss it. It feels subconscious because the slide is a little bit buried in the mix, but it echoes. It's just enough beats off. It's like a delay, a dreamy psychological type of delay. And there's some cool twingy little flourishes there. And then in Road, River, and Rail, there is an atmospheric layer that feels like baritone sax almost. Specifically, there's that group Borin Under Club of Gore, the the sort of like ambient doom jazz group, where they stretch out instruments until they get really Lynchian, like they did with the Justin Bieber song Slowed Down 800%, and it sounded like a really cool ambient record. There's some stretching in addition to, like, it feels like there's a lot of compression and density in this record that like mushes all into a softness, but they stretch the taffy as well on a few of them. The layers do go in really different directions and textures, and I appreciate that variety. But those were a few that really stood out to me. I'm also surprised that like the title track hasn't taken off as a TikTok audio yet. There's just something about the phasing that they use in that feels really timely or tailored to a time when people are like clearly clamoring through whatever warped nostalgia is happening on the internet right now. They're like clamoring to cobble a relationship with time and memory. It feels like a perfect song to do, like, I'm wearing my mom's shit from the 90s or whatever, Maybe one day it will. Maybe it has, and that pocket just hasn't reached my For You page yet. What about you?
I might to try to get to the Cocteau side of Twitter or of TikTok.
Commenting to stay on Cocteau Talk. Or, don't search for Cock Talk. That's a different thing.
Yeah, lots of check your spelling in this episode for sure. I would agree with you and just draw out a couple of like particular aspects of that were interesting to me when I think about the layers. One is, this will be a fun little needle to thread, but you mentioned compression. So specifically though, not compression as defined in audio production. This has actually a lot less of that type of compression than like the loudness type records that we were talking about before. However, I know what you mean, and it is great to listen to how the blending, the exact correct volumic and loudness related blending of all these layers together, to the degree that none of them become foreground versus background, but are sort of this, like, they're going in as a unit into every song. And to that end, I think a fun exercise, speaking of not overthinking it, don't be a music nerd in this moment. I'm speaking to myself, not you.
Don't turn on the lights in Space Mountain like the Dissect guy.
Exactly. So picking out what's melody versus harmony. So again, don't overthink it here and like debate with me. Like, don't do the like. It can obviously be in a minor or a major key all the time, bro. Like, I know. But what I mean by this is,
you were writing this essay, I was busy in public with my friends, kissing a human person,
touching grass so much I actually roll it up and keep it in my pocket. But playing with your interpretation in a song of what is supposed to be the main melody line and what is supposed to be accompanying this in the moment is surprisingly not difficult, but like fun. Like it catches you off guard because
it's evasive.
Exactly. Yeah. And to try to draw some contrast, like me and you, Kyle, are both lovers of like riff-driven guitar music. That is melody-driven music by any other name. Like a particular instrument is carrying a melody. Everything else is sort of playing around or with that idea.
Dude, I did have that thought. The Adam Tamboos or the At the Gates type stuff where it's really melodic riff writing, where you could just listen to the instrumentals and carry those tunes around in your head all day, singing them like pop songs.
Yeah.
They definitely have that with the instrumental arrangements here.
It is related to, but distinct from, a pop hook.
Totally.
Like, there are memorable aspects of all this music that you'll catch yourself singing and humming around to, but it's almost never the chorus vocal hook that you would traditionally expect out of a pop song. It'll be the intro or something tacked on to the end, or like a particular little bit that you didn't notice in one of the songs until you listen to it a few times through. Like, just trying to dial in on, is there actually a singular melody happening in this moment at all? Or is this sort of just like vibe surfing throughout a key? Like, just allowing yourself to approach it that way and sort of intentionally de-intellectualize it without dumbing it down, because it's not dumb, but just sort of not overthinking it. Like, to me, that is what helps click in so quickly with this every time. Like, even when you're actively focused on it, I'm still bobbing my head to a rhythm that I'm not even actively focused on, because it just works.
There was a video that I saw years and years ago when the song came out, but Tuesday by McConan and Drake, where music theorists sat at a piano and played the chords and talked about how they don't resolve. And that mirrored the feeling of being at the club on a weeknight, indicating that you're the type of person at a party that never ends, and a bit in a good way and a bit in a melancholy way. And I think of that every time I listen to that song, but it's also not like, well, I wonder what they were thinking in the studio. I wonder if Sonny Digital was thinking about that the chords don't resolve or whatever. You can have some fun adding in conscious or subconscious, unconscious thought around a thing, but like, don't let it detract from the actual content, which on its face with no thinking is a thing that can fill you with feelings. I think that's what you're trying to say, right? Something along those lines. Yeah.
Yeah. That's why I love this exploration, man. Just using musical art as a way to like pass your absurdist thoughts through and try to communicate with another person. It's magical. When we do these fucking episodes with each other, I look into your face as one of my longest friends. And like, somehow we are able to talk about shit without ever having to use the right words to do it. And like, that's magical every time. And it's stuff that I love to give other people through this. Once again, I'll just always tell people through this podcast that we pretty much expected to never do more than a handful of episodes about, but people keep telling us is good or helpful or something. But it's fun to track my own personal changes through it and how it impacts me. And one of those things, which I kind of want to mention before we go into here are 30,000 doors for you to exit. One thing that I feel like I've gotten better at, that you've always been good at, Kyle, because I remember when you shared with me one day that you're like, I made playlists like based on like a feeling. And I was like, my brain was like, the fuck did he say? What do you mean? Like, in what way, And that was always a cool exercise for me to like try to understand what it is you were doing through that. But like, being able to discern a describable, visceral feeling about a record is a skill I've become better at through these discussions. Yeah. And for me, this one was the feeling, it especially to me mapped to those intense things that were happening for the band at the time, where they're experiencing extreme joy and grief all at once. And for me, this record musically and energetically feels like, and I know some people do this, I don't know if everyone does, but when you stand in the shower and you have no intention whatsoever of doing anything except standing in that shower and being pummeled with the hottest water you can possibly cook up, and you're just going to stand there until whatever feeling you have in that moment evaporates and leaves you, because there's nothing else to do except I need to be overwhelmed by body sensation. I need to be trapped in a room that I can't get out of. I need to sit, so to speak, in this feeling that sort of activates all the heat is activating something in my body that's trying to release whatever it is I'm going through, whether it's good or bad. It just becomes sort of an overwhelming feeling, and you just get to reset a little bit, just standing in the water, knowing that no one can talk to you and you can't do anything right now. You can't like look at your phone. Like, you can't distract yourself. And like that feeling when you've locked into something and accepted that like, I need to sit here until this leaves me, that became my visual of what this album felt like to me, all the way from the way that everything is in perfect non-literal harmony with one another, like volume wise, it feels like a wash over you. No matter what sort of headphones you listen to, whatever frequency it's drawing out has a wash sensation to it. So you get all these different feelings of being sort of encapsulated by these songs that, once again, don't, because the vocals themselves and the lyrics aren't such a critical point of the music, it never takes you out of that overwhelming feeling, because I never have to figure out if I understand what she's saying or what she's trying to talk about. It just is. And like, it's a real gift to find records like this, because I don't get it, especially outside of heavy music very often. But this one did that for me. And I will enjoy returning to this record when I want to feel that feeling again.
That was so thoughtfully put. I kind of experience the feelings, but the opposite way you do, which is why I so enjoy having these conversations. Like the blanking out bit for me is like staying at the surface, not going into the big deep. Like I just envision the consciousness inside my body as a big ass house, or like a big plane, physical plane that I'm a small thing in the middle of. Like I'm a huge cosmic body with a little brain person inside of it in the middle. And the saving it off, the blanking out bit, is staying up at the very top, right outside the elevator before it goes down. And that's the place that I normally like to live. That's why I like shit like the Stooges. Like, it just is what it is. Like, come have a beer before you get in the elevator and think about your feelings or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, fucking trash the lamp or whatever in this waiting room. It's literal and feral and blues. And, you know, there's nothing more to it than what it is. It's a big exercise, and it's a lot of physical travel to go down into the depths of yourself, which I think is what this record does. But I think what's so beautiful about it is they see a beautiful place down in the middle of it. And I'm specifically thinking about Liz in this way, but this also applies to the two gentlemen, where they want to come back up the elevator and describe it to you. And that's what the offering of this record is. Like, the walls are these beautiful colors, and there's a great view of a grassy knoll outside, and there's all these things happening. So it's the blankness that you're describing, in the sense that, like, oh, I found a peaceful place at the center, or I'm longing for a peaceful place that I haven't reached at the center of my consciousness / the cosmos / you know, the golden thread between that macro out in the universe and that thing inside me. And I'm feeling like anyone who's never done psychedelics can't really understand or visualize what we're talking about. But it's real. And I hope, as like a therapeutic exercise, people can take a record like this and envision that bigness inside of themselves, and maybe extract your own beautiful thing that doesn't need to be too literal or like anything you've ever seen. You know, just start like putting colors places, or singing in a weird language, or writing your own hieroglyphics or something. Just like extract that big feeling of describing the huge universe inside you to other people. I know that's what the creative process is, just described in maybe kind of a freaky way.
Totally. Man, I love that. Reminds me of the album title from Cloud Kicker, Let Yourself Be Huge. And I remember that phrase just stuck in my brain, and, you know, as a closely related sibling to that Marianne Williamson quote from A Unique Person, but it's a pretty good quote. Finding yourself in that space and getting comfortable with it. It's a blankness that's much more reminiscent of a, so to speak, successful meditation session than it is getting too drunk and not being able to think about anything. It's not really that.
And I think you and I are both really striving to offer a visualization exercise, a spiritual visualization exercise of sorts, because I think everybody's feeling some version of that and trying to ascribe something to that, you know, all the longing about like, what is my purpose? Who am I? Why am I? There's not an answer at the end of the exercise, but there's a direction that you can go in. And the really, really beautiful works of art throughout history. And I love that I saw a lot of comparisons to visual artists, Rothko and Agnes Martin, and minimalist interpretive type artists. The mark of a really great artist is it helps you find your own way to truth and to beauty. And I hope, like, if even one person listens to this record and uncovers some beautiful truth about themselves or the community they live in or their family or, you know, somebody they care about, then that's a win. And I think that's something that the three members of this group would be deeply delighted by.
I love it. Speaking of right turns, let's take one out of earnestness just into, let's play another round of We're Better Than Your Stupid Algorithm, because your algorithm can never be cred, and we can at least try to be, I don't know, do a pretty good job at it. But like we mentioned earlier, like this is another one of those gifts of records that will take you in a lot of directions. You can go in all of them, or if you hate some of them, all good. You have plenty of space to play. And so many things can be kind of traced back to this, but it is mostly, once again, about a discovery exercise, which we enjoy sending other people on, even though, I mean, we don't make any money by sending people to music. In fact, the people who make the music don't make any money when you stream their music either.
Damn.
But like we're doing it for the love of the game. There is so much joy in discovering something new because a sound or an idea sent you in a direction. So let's do it. Where do you want to start?
Let's talk about the impact of this record. And you listed a few, and I'll just augment.
Yeah, it was trivial to find people directly and objectively saying, yes, Cocteau Twins, yes, that one, that is us. And you get a nice smorgasbord of different people, even just from the Direct Quotes Club. So going on a little journey here. First of all, The Weeknd sampled Cocteau Twins and was like, it is clearly an unabashed fan. And then in interviews with Cocteau Twins members, they cite that as well as being something they're cool with, like excited about, that it was sampled. So you can probably already imagine if a Weeknd song popped into your head just now, you can start tracing that lineage if you'd like. Other places, this was a record released in 1990. And like we talked about, not only contributed to dream pop, but also shoegaze from a number of perspectives. And so there's a ton of stuff to dive into there, especially if that's not a aspect of music you've explored a ton. Yes, My Bloody Valentine is in there and all that, but like Lush, who was sort of like an OG shoegaze band, Slow Dive, even like bands like Mazzy Star from the 90s, like kind of those underrated bands that shot out a few hits that were really cool. So there was like a lot of inspiration happening in that time, in the moments in between both The Weeknd and the bands that were formed in the early 90s. I mean, you've got Deftones, you've got M83, Japanese Breakfast, Beach House, all of these different little flagship artists in very different genres, just pointing directly back to either this record or this band and this period of time in general as like truly inspiring their approach to sound, especially ethereal layer building around their music. And I think also, hard to pull out a direct quote about this, but also inspired, I think, a lot of these bands to, again, not overthink particular things that are considered to be staples of music, like, oh, I need a very strong lyrical direction and clear vocals. I'm like, well, she didn't, and they made this. So I think I'll chill out,
I would add in the like vocal influence or dream pop succession lineage, a bunch more things. You can get all the way down to like Arca, who do, fragmented Björky type pop stuff. But there's definitely some influence there. Lana Del Rey. And then there's a lot of stuff, like if you look at like Cocteau Twins and like My Bloody Valentine as a continuum between maybe like true punk, Sex Pistols, Stooges, MC5, guitar-y, crunchier stuff being the My Bloody Valentine world, and then Roxy music, David Bowie, arty stuff coming down the pipe to Cocteau Twins. Somewhere between those two, you're going to find stuff like the first few Sleepy Sun records with Rachel Fannin, like Stereo Lab, weaving in some of the like trip hoppy stuff too. So like Letitia Sadier, I think Chelsea Wolfe, who we talked about before, is a great example. FKA Twigs, you mentioned earlier in the episode, Bat for Lashes, Juliana Barwick, Way as Blood, Wyoke, the XX, Jamie XX is another great example. You mentioned Beach House. Like I would specifically point to them because they are on Bella Union, Simon Raymond's label.
Oh, I didn't even remember that. Okay.
Like that to me seems like they're a bit anointed. The group that is getting compared to Cocteau Twins being signed to his label is like, yeah, they're a spiritual successor for sure. So Victoria LaGrange, another great voice. Marissa Nadler, also on Bella Union. Bella Union itself is a great rabbit hole of like emotive, washy type stuff. Personal favorite of mine, Jonathan Wilson, is on Bella Union. So if you're into the like more Dylan-y type fare, as is Father John Misty, as is the Dirty Three, Warren Ellis. And then because they're huge, I feel like I should also make a connection to Cigarettes After Sex and Men I Trust. There's a line from this to that. And then you mentioned Slow Dive. I think like Ride is another great example. Jesus and Mary Chain. I just saw Unwound pretty recently. They start to take it into darker territory, but I think you could, if you want a little bit of the darker stuff, you could start going in that direction. We talked about Holy Fawn on Friday Heavy. It's another example.
That's
Slow Crush, very much in the lineage of like now shoegaze is famous. They're a personal favorite. Crumb is another one. There's a band from Athens that I really, really love called New Madrid that I like this one New Madrid record, Magnet Queen, Magnet King, for the same reasons I like Heaven or Las Vegas. There's where that feels like being in a dream. This feels like the New Madrid record feels like being delusional in the Georgia summer heat, kind of getting like haze. Deer Hunter, another Georgia band. And then in addition to Deftones, I would also say the Smashing Pumpkins, who have done cool stuff with guitar chaining. And then if you want to go really heavy, a lot of people like Loathe for a very, very current example. And then there's also like the whole rabbit hole of slowcore, stuff like Duster, that mixes things with whole strains of different feelings, but I think getting at sort of the same dreamlike state.
Right on. I'm going to keep going. Those are all awesome, especially exploring some of the potential fringes of this stuff to go in especially weird directions. Before I get to those fringes, though, you mentioned Lana Del Rey. I think I say this with sincerity, if you're not a self-described like deep musical nerd at this point, but Lana Del Rey was something that went, oh, okay, yeah, I know that. I got you. Cool. That's fine. That's an avenue worth pursuing too. I would encourage you to think about things that could be sort of spiritually mapped along that track without trying to be too contentious. Like Tame Impala is a band that does, generally speaking, a similar sort of like introduction to psych type thing that I think is aligned with what Lana Del Rey has done or is doing. Purity Ring is a band that I really wanted to bring back up here again to kind of explore. Like, those are just three bands that will take you in weird directions, but that your friends will still know if you mention those bands. So I think that's a cool place to start if you want to, or you're not sure where to. I think a couple of fringy-ish directions, or a few. One of them would be like the post-rock and ambient stuff that was and is a spiritual descendant of this. Many of these bands can directly point to early 90s type music, not only Cocteau Twins, but even bands like Melvins, like stuff that was happening in the 90s. You can see it develop into longer term, like weirder and more ethereal types of guitar driven music. In that sense, especially if you're on like the calmer side of things, I mentioned Mono earlier. That's a band we've covered a lot who has like direct ties with Steve Albini and the early 90s and all that stuff. So there is a lineage there. But we also mentioned Sigur Rós. While they were not a band who the entire time was directly inspired by Cocteau Twins, Kyle, you found a quote from Jonesy about basically they kept getting compared to Cocteau Twins and didn't like it until Jonesy started listening to them and was good with it, to the degree that he got Elizabeth Fraser to sing on one of the songs on his solo record. And again, just bringing back up that little mantra of like, when really cool artists go, oh yeah, that shit rules, pay attention. They're probably right about it, or at least there's something cool that's being discovered there.
You know, Liz Fraser post Cocteau Twins has been so interesting because she has largely, I think you could characterize it as walking away from music, but has done some really thoughtful collaboration, one of which is that one you just mentioned. The most famous one, obviously, is with Massive Attack, and she sang with them live at their anniversary shows for that record, Mezzanine. My favorite part of that whole thing, like other than the fact that she has said like pretty directly, I was singing about Jeff Buckley in a grieving way, the lyrics were inspired by the philosopher Gaston Bachelard, who was an influence on Foucault, Lecourt, Derrida, Pierre Bourdieu. And Bachelard was interesting because he was an epistemologist, like he was a thinker around the nature of knowledge and knowing, which I think like spiritually gets at some of the direction of what Liz Fraser was trying to do with her vocals and lack thereof. But he popularized the idea of the Ophelia complex, like in reference to Shakespeare's Ophelia, which is described as a nexus of ideas linking the dissolution of the self, male or female, with immersion in the feminine element of water, as symbolized by Ophelia's drowning, which is kind of spooky, like when you conspiracy theory tie it to Jeff Buckley or whatever. But like I just sense a cosmic link between all those things. And I'm also really inspired by the smarts behind that kind of thing. Like that Liz Fraser is the kind of artist who's just casually reading like modern philosophers and layering in 10,000 inputs of thought into words that neither you nor necessarily she can discern. And then all that to say, thinking about directions that are not necessarily intuitive, I was thinking about like what other vocalists, if you like specifically Liz Fraser's vocals, would you also like? And, you know, beyond thinking about like Belinda Butcher from My Bloody Valentine or Beth Gibbons from Portishead or Björk or Sinead O'Connor or Hope Sandoval from Mazzy Star, all those people you mentioned, and some more. Sade is another great example.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, I bet Hayley Williams would kill some Cocteau Twins stuff. And then I went to listen to her solo record, Petals for Armor, to see if there was anything Cocteau Twinsy. And then I saw a single called Teardrop, and lo and behold, it was a cover of the Massive Attack song. And, you know, I talked about the runs and the interesting flitters that only Liz Fraser can do. And damn if Hayley Williams didn't give it a real good go.
Shakes me, makes me lighter. Feel it so much. Teardrop on the fire. Feel it so much.
People that love Paramore are intense about how she's like one of the best singers around, but I think people who like put up the pop wall around Paramore don't realize what a phenomenal, like maybe one of the best of our generation vocalists she is. And you can sense that in her approximation of Liz Fraser's vocals, you know, that and the fact that like when they played Wembley pretty recently, she did the Freddie Mercury thing that Queen live at Wembley did. But there's a lot to unpack just with like really great sort of singular vocalists in the spirit of Liz, even if they don't sound exactly like her.
Totally. To explore maybe another direction or sort of fringy bit, I'm going to basically incorrectly summarize all of this stuff as like chill wave. Just let's just label
like
this bucket chill wave.
It's got a bad name, but it kind of works.
Yeah,
there's a new sensation happening. Let's label it before we're ready.
It is an evocative enough phrase to slap on the outside of this container. So inside of that are artists that will make you seem cool to people, including Washed Out and Toro et Moi. Or even if you want to get a little bit less weird, again, I kind of knowingly realize that he doesn't fit in this particular container, but like Tycho, like the sort of like light feeling ethereal, it is maybe made from electronics, but maybe not type of stuff. Those are all directions that you can pursue that have sort of varying levels of of psychedelia or dream poppiness or shoegaziness or whatever, but piped through other forms of instrumentation or production for music. If you want to really touch a weird fringe, I realized, because we saw them recently in Brooklyn, The Armed is maybe a very good far out place you can go if you're like, okay, that feeling of being overwhelmed by lushness, I would like to turn that up until it clips. Like, okay, The Armed and Ultra Pop and some of the stuff that they are trying to do over there, while fundamentally different sonically than this record at all, has moves that smell a lot like what was happening here. And just
it's dream pop and awake pop.
yeah, just seeing them do that live once again just reminded me that, like, no, I need to remember that The Armed is like, it is a house with a little door that goes under the front porch. And if you can shove a few people inside and tell them to crawl in the right direction, they will end up in a very cool house that they never would have walked in the front door of before. So I'm just going to keep doing it, because if you end up liking bands like that, then all of your friends think you're weird and cool at the same time. And I got to tell you, that's the balance you want to strike.
I also Googled, like recommended if you like, and forums are the best place to find the algorithm breaking stuff, where you get a peek into somebody's brain. It's like, I literally never would have thought of that. And it's just stuffed on one person's mixtape, in Kenosha, Wisconsin or whatever. Somebody in a forum suggested Rocksteady and Philly Soul for like ethereal vocals. So somebody suggested Cornell Campbell specifically.
Okay.
Somebody suggested the Delphonics, the Flamingos, and even Smokey Robinson. And then one other person name checked John Anderson from Yes, who did similar strange layering things with vocals. So if you're looking for like singularity and want to push into like way different ways to do kind of the same thing, any of those might be options as well. And like, you've invoked King Tubby a number of times on this episode. It can't be underscored enough. King Tubby, Tangerine Dream, people that are doing interesting things with technology as an instrument, sort of expanding the possibilities of human vibration. I think all of that belongs in the same school for that reason.
We could go on, but we won't. Hopefully that sends you in a direction, or at the very least stops you at the station of this record if you haven't spent a lot of time there. One of the gifts of picking an album, especially off the calendar thing, which like we made and like love that it exists in general. But the magic of this is just like you pick up one of these albums and you go, well, I know that it's supposed to be important. Let's figure out if I can reverse engineer why. And just like making your way into how it can have a personal impact on you. Like everything we've talked about, whether it's just like how to experience the record or how to, more accurately describe a visceral feeling that it gives you, or chasing all of the downstream artists from there. These are all little, truly non-ironically magical things that can just happen to you on a day-to-day basis. Like I know we talk about this almost every episode now, but it is a practice that gets built up and becomes something that's like really rewarding. And it's cool to be able to do it to albums that you have a hard time getting, because you can draw a lot out of something. But then for me, well, like with this one, you also have these moments where it's like, I feel like I have been listening to this record.
I've unlocked the whole universe.
Much more so than I actually have. Yeah. And that is itself a really cool experience, which, you mentioned comparisons to visual art and all that. Like, I mean, you got to go to a physical place to go see if you can have that experience from a lot of visual art. You can try to approximate it through a video or a picture, but a lot of times you got to see the thing in person to get there. And just not to overstate it, but it is such a gift to exist at a time where basically all of recorded history's music exists a few clicks away from you for the dramatically underpriced monthly subscription fee that we are charged. And the fact that you can transport yourself into things like this and learn so much so quickly is just like, what else is there? What else is better than figuring out your own version of doing this through the things you encounter in life?
But
Just makes me
hopefully the feeling that you get the first time you listen to this record, because we talked about the immediacy again and again. Hopefully as you go out and journey, you remember and give thanks to this record as hopefully a new center point of sorts. Like I know this will be for me. I think this, when we get to 100 episodes, I'll think back to Cocteau Twins, and they'll be one of the ones that we mention again and again, like I've done with Alice Coltrane and Björk and others. I'm thankful to have this new anchor point, and I hope that it's an anchor point for people listening to this as well.
Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win a free vinyl copy of the album we just covered. And follow us on Instagram and Twitter for even more info about the album, including playlists, links to interesting articles and videos, and even some stories that didn't make the episode. Most importantly, though, please support your favorite local record store or concert venue, or buy merch from a band you love. Thanks for listening.